Okay, moving on to the second topic, I'm going to have you, you know this already, read a particular article of mine, in fact, a chapter of a book that I'm in the process of writing, and it's on this whole notion, asking the question, are there any Hebrew goddesses? I mean, we sometimes understand Yahweh, the Israelite God, as kind of a pansexual being having the qualities of both maleness and femaleness. We saw that in Genesis 1:27. But at other times, I might venture to say, most commonly, we're going to see Yahweh, we have seen Yahweh as a male deity. And if Yahweh is a male deity, that raises some obvious questions, which is, does Yahweh have a girlfriend? Does Yahweh have a consort or a wife, some divine female companion to kind of balance out the maleness of Yahweh? Does Yahweh have any children? What is Yahweh's relationship to the fertility of the land, that which has been customarily associated with goddesses? And how does all this work? Bringing us to a much more broadly general question is, what is the relationship of the female and the divine in the ancient Israelite literature? And there are a number of ways we can approach this, and I want to cover three. I want to talk about goddesses in Israel's distant past. Then I want to talk about some lingering goddesses within the Israelite narrative, and then some of the ways that Yahweh assimilates the characteristics, the features of some of these goddesses. So we're going to try to break our information here up into a threefold pattern. So the first one are goddesses in Israel's distant past. And there is, in fact, ample evidence, both within the Bible and in archaeology, things they've actually dug up, inscriptional evidence, that there were three goddesses whose images, whose objects, and whose names were fairly common in ancient Israelite history. And they are Asherah, that's the most common one, and Asherah in some texts is actually described as Yahweh's consort. It'll say Yahweh and his Asherah in a formula that seems to be indicating husband and wife, male deity and male deity's consort. So there's Asherah, there's Anat, and there's Astarte. I probably should write those down. Astarte, there we go. Astarte also translates in Babylonian as Ishtar, and might have some distant relationship to the name of the Christian holiday, Easter. Roughly related, these three female figures are slightly different, although there's an occasional overlap here and there. But Asherah is kind of a female fertility deity, understood as the wife of the major male god in a pantheon, usually described as El in a lot of the biblical literature and the other literature in the region. Anat is a warrior goddess, and Astarte is in some ways an overlap with Asherah, very similar roles. And these goddesses are worshipped throughout Israel during most of their history. Now, how does this appear in the Bible? In the Bible, this appears that these figures are demonized. For the most part, in later Israelite writing, and we'll be talking about why this happened in a few moments, but in later Israelite writing, these figures are declared to be non-Israelite, and they're declared to be a threat to the purity of the Israelite religion. Now, how do they do that? And I have to emphasize that there is not a trace in archaeology of this reason of any indication that certain groups didn't worship these goddesses and other groups did. They were pretty much widespread throughout the region, throughout the period. So what does the biblical writer do to demonize these three figures to say that they are in fact not Israelite? Well, one of the things they do is they throw the worship of these figures back into Israel's distant pagan past. Virtually all biblical literature and most of the interpretations that come afterwards have always claimed that Israel had not always existed since the beginning of time, but rather came out of pagan stock, and at a certain point God called a certain individual out, or at a certain point a charismatic teacher brought this new conception, but that these goddesses were something that Israel rejected when they became Israelites. So that's one way that it's explained. Another way that it's explained is by assigning these three deities and others as foreign gods, that they move into Israel not as native stock of the territory, but rather they come in from the outside. They're foreign, they're other, they're invaders. And the final way, and this is done in more modern times because it's very troubling to many biblical scholars and many students of the Bible to imagine that an Israel of an earlier time tolerated a kind of polytheism. So, another explanation is that this was characteristic of the rejected, superficial, inaccurate, popular religion, that there were these ignorant people who didn't really know what they were saying and what they were believing, and they just followed this, but the elite, the official religion, the religion that's associated with the temple and the priesthood, well, that religion, that was pure. But the common people, the poor people, and you could immediately see how such an argument could be used ideologically to kind of wall out the belief that you personally don't like and to only accept in as true Israelite religion that which you yourself agree with. So what we have here is a very strong presence in ancient Israel of the worship of female goddesses. It's very commonly known that in certain Israelite segments, Yahweh is known to have a female consort. There's a Jewish community in Egypt, and we have documents from this community. They actually built a temple, but they didn't build a temple to Yahweh. They built a temple to Yahweh and his Asherah. And we have two very famous documents that come from 600 or 700 BCE that, again, speak of Yahweh and his Asherah. We do have that kind of evidence. However, and here we're moving into the second notion here, at a certain point in Israel's history, the dominant group decided that Israel was going to be monotheistic. And we have to stop for a moment and reflect on what we mean by that term. Israel, it appears, through most of its history, was what we call polytheistic, many gods. They believed that many gods existed. At a certain point, Israel made a transition, it changed, and became monotheistic. One God, belief in one God. But what does monotheism really mean? And this is where we get in trouble, because there are, in fact, a number of different definitions of monotheism. Some of them have had connected to them particular words, and I'm just going to introduce you to two of the most common ones. They are henotheism. Now, in terms of word origin, henotheism and monotheism are identical. Heno is simply another Greek word for one, so it means one God. But henotheism is usually understood as belief in many gods, but special loyalty to only one. You understand the distinction. Other gods might exist. For instance, other nations might have their own national gods, and there might be a particular god that you would approach if you wanted success with your crops. But your main god, your chief god, your main man is, in this case, Yahweh. That's henotheism. And probably henotheism in some of its forms is a lot more common through most of Israelite history than other forms of monotheism that we'll get to in a few moments. For instance, the first commandment, as quoted in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 6, the first commandment says, "You shall have no other gods before me." It doesn't say no other gods exist. It says you shall have no other gods before me, which can either mean no other gods in my presence. So when you worship me, Yahweh says, you better worship only me and not bring any of these other guys around. Or it could mean you shall have no other gods before me. I am the chief God. I am the main God. I'm the God that has supreme control over all the other gods. So it's putting Yahweh in first place. So that's henotheism. And it's a lot more common belief in the Hebrew Bible than what I'm going to call radical monotheism. Get to that in a moment. Another term that's commonly used is monolatry. You have the mono again, which means one, and the Greek word latria, which means worship. So this means regardless of what you believe about the existence of other gods, you only worship one. And the best explanation that's been given about why we moved from polytheism to some form of henotheism, monolatry, is that Yahweh was a national God. Yahweh was regarded first and foremost as the God of the nation of Israel, and then was understood as being the patron god of the Davidic dynasty, the dynasty that was founded by King David. And so he enlarged, and then in times of national emergency, you would put away the worship of other gods and you'd focus on the God that you really wanted help from. So you might believe in other gods, but you're going to look to this God exclusively. And I've been hinting at a more radical form of monotheism, and that's actually what I call it, radical monotheism. Radical monotheism, which is the kind of monotheism you're probably most familiar with, was relatively rare, kind of an extreme case through most of Israel's history. What radical monotheism says is that only one God exists. All other gods are delusional, figments of imagination, or in extreme cases maybe they're demons. But there's only one God who exists. It's a much more radical position, and in fact it's the position most commonly represented in formulations of monotheism that one finds in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So for the most part, the overwhelming majority of Jews, Christians, and Muslims are radical monotheists. What I'm arguing is that early Israel was not. And what happened was, at a time of, at the time of Persian conquest, the Persians had to deal with some segment within the conquered Jewish population in Palestine. And the segment they chose to deal with were the radical monotheists, who I believe were the priestly party, the ones who were in charge of the what's left of the temple, the rebuilt temple, the ones who were in charge with overseeing the teaching. And at this point, because there's no king, these are also the administrative heads of the government, the occupied government. So the Persians go to the priestly party, the radical monotheists, and they say, we want you to consolidate and define your nation, your culture in written form. And this is at least a pretty good theory of one of the reasons why the Bible, which had been continuously produced and transmitted over 1,000 years at this point, why at this point a group of people decided to put it together in an organized and a coherent and a fixed fashion. So it's the priestly party, the radical monotheists, during the time of Persian conquest that put together the Bible. And so even though they represented a minority position through most of the biblical period, they are the ones who ultimately get to define the nature of God and the nature of the other gods and goddesses who seem to inherit the Israelite belief system through most of their history. Now,